On the 4th of June, 1942, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers burned like funeral pyres in the Central Pacific, their crews screaming as aviation fuel ignited in cascading explosions that sent columns of black smoke 10,000 feet into the air. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard his flagship Yamato, 70 nautical miles away, receiving fragmentary radio transmissions that transformed confidence into catastrophe within the span of 5 minutes. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had promised his emperor 6 months of victories, now watched his entire strategic doctrine dissolve into the flames consuming Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 6 months earlier, Japanese naval aviators had executed the most devastating surprise attack in modern warfare. The strike on Pearl Harbor had sunk or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,000 Americans. Tokyo had erupted in celebration. Emperor Hirohito's military council, dominated by Admiral Osami Nagano and his aggressive faction, had interpreted this tactical success as validation of their entire approach to naval warfare. Their doctrine emphasized offensive carrier strikes, decisive battle, and the spiritual superiority of Japanese warriors over Western materialism. The Americans, they assured themselves, lacked the will to fight a protracted Pacific War. This conviction permeated every level of Japanese strategic planning. The Imperial Navy's War Council operated under assumptions forged during decades of victories against China and Russia. They had studied Alfred Thayer Mahan's theories of naval power, but adapted them through a uniquely Japanese lens that emphasized Bushido spirit and offensive aggression. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, had internalized these principles so thoroughly that flexibility became synonymous with weakness. When subordinates suggested defensive preparations or reconnaissance priorities at Midway, Nagumo dismissed such concerns as defeatist thinking unworthy of samurai descendants. The War Council's operational planning revealed fatal rigidity beneath surface brilliance. They had crafted the Midway operation as a complex, multi-pronged offensive involving nearly 200 ships across thousands of miles of ocean. The plan called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, a carrier strike on Midway Atoll, an amphibious invasion force, and distant battleship support, including Yamamoto's super battleship Yamato, with its 18-inch guns. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Japanese Naval Staff College archives, planners devoted enormous attention to coordination timelines, but virtually none to contingency responses if Americans deviated from predicted behavior. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, later recorded in his diary that the War Council dismissed intelligence warnings about American carrier movements near Midway. Japanese naval intelligence had been compromised, their operational codes broken by American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii. But arrogance blinded Tokyo's leadership to this possibility. Commander Joseph Rochefort's team had deciphered Japanese communications, revealing Midway as the target. Intelligence that Admiral Chester Nimitz trusted completely despite skepticism from Washington. This intelligence asymmetry would prove decisive, yet Japanese commanders proceeded as though surprise remained entirely on their side, their doctrine offering no framework for adapting, when foundational assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. The Japanese naval establishment had spent 4 decades preparing for one climactic engagement that would decide Pacific supremacy. This concept, known as Kantai Kessen, or decisive battle doctrine, originated from Japan's stunning victory over Russia at Tsushima Strait in May 1905, where Admiral Heihachiro Togo's fleet had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in a single afternoon. That triumph had elevated decisive battle theory to the status of religious dogma within Japanese naval circles. Every subsequent wargame, every training exercise, every strategic discussion revolved around creating conditions for another Tsushima-style annihilation of the enemy fleet. Admiral Yamamoto himself harbored private doubts about applying 19th-century battle concepts to 20th-century carrier warfare, but he remained institutionally powerless to challenge the orthodoxy. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo, led by Admiral Nagano, operated within a command structure that rewarded conformity and punished innovation. Officers who questioned decisive battle doctrine found their careers stalling, while those who enthusiastically embraced offensive aggression received choice assignments. This institutional culture created an echo chamber where critical analysis suffocated beneath layers of groupthink and cultural pressure to demonstrate unwavering loyalty. The doctrine's fundamental flaw lay in its assumption that Japan could dictate the terms of engagement. Japanese planners believed their superior training, better torpedoes, and longer-ranged aircraft would allow them to identify American forces first, strike first, and retire before effective counterattack. At Midway, they planned to lure American carriers into a trap where Japanese numerical superiority would overwhelm whatever forces Admiral Nimitz could scrape together after Pearl Harbor's devastation. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans possessed only 2 operational carriers in the Pacific, Enterprise and Hornet, with Yorktown still under repair after the Coral Sea battle in early May. These estimates catastrophically underestimated American industrial capacity and determination. Yorktown had indeed suffered significant damage during Coral Sea, the first carrier versus carrier battle in history, where Japanese forces sank the carrier Lexington and damaged Yorktown. Naval architects at Pearl Harbor's dry dock had estimated 3 months for repairs. Instead, working around the clock in a feat of engineering improvisation, 1,500 workers completed essential repairs in 72 hours. Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on the 30th of May, her forward elevator still operating manually, and temporary steel plates welded over hull damage. Japanese intelligence never detected her departure. The decisive battle doctrine also failed to account for asymmetric warfare or attritional campaigns. Japanese planners had studied the First World War, but concluded that Western industrial warfare represented decadence rather than adaptability. They convinced themselves that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantages in any prolonged conflict. Historical records from the Privy Council meetings in Tokyo, as documented in Herbert Bix's comprehensive biography of Emperor Hirohito, reveal leaders who genuinely believed a series of rapid victories would break American morale and force a negotiated peace that left Japan dominant in Asia. None seriously prepared for a scenario where Americans absorbed initial defeats and counterattacked with growing strength. This strategic myopia extended to logistics and sustainability. The Imperial Navy designed its carriers, aircraft, and tactics for offensive operations within a relatively short time frame. Japanese carriers lacked the damage control systems, redundant communications, and firefighting equipment that American designers had incorporated after studying British experiences in the Atlantic. When battle damage occurred, Japanese ships had limited capacity to contain fires or maintain operations. The doctrine assumed victories would come quickly and decisively, making defensive resilience unnecessary. Midway would expose this assumption as lethally naive. Commander Joseph Rochefort worked in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor designated Station Hypo, surrounded by IBM tabulating machines and exhausted cryptanalysts who had been breaking Japanese naval codes since early 1942. By mid-May, Rochefort's team had intercepted and partially decrypted messages indicating a major Japanese operation against a target designated AF in Japanese communications. The challenge lay in confirming AF's identity. Japanese planners used location codes precisely to prevent such intelligence breakthroughs. Rochefort devised an elegant deception. He had Midway send an uncoded message reporting fresh water supply problems. Within days, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked. Midway was the target. Admiral Nimitz trusted Rochefort's analysis despite skepticism from Washington intelligence officials, who believed the Japanese would strike at Hawaii or the American West Coast. This trust reflected Nimitz's willingness to challenge conventional thinking, an intellectual flexibility conspicuously absent from the Japanese command structure. Nimitz positioned Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese carrier force as it approached the atoll. American carriers would strike first, inverting the fundamental assumption of Japanese planning. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence suffered from institutional dysfunction and overconfidence. The Naval General Staff's Intelligence Bureau had failed to detect American code-breaking success, assuming their communications remained secure despite mounting evidence of compromised operations. Multiple instances of American forces appearing in unexpected positions should have triggered security reviews, but the culture of infallibility prevented such self-examination. Junior intelligence officers who raised concerns about communication security found their warnings ignored by superiors, who considered such worries evidence of defeatism. Japanese reconnaissance before Midway proved disastrously inadequate. The operational plan called for long-range seaplanes launched from French frigate shoals, northwest of Hawaii, to conduct surveillance of Pearl Harbor before the Midway attack. This reconnaissance mission, designated Operation K, had worked once in March but failed in May when Americans stationed a seaplane tender at the shoals specifically to prevent Japanese use of the anchorage. Without aerial surveillance of Pearl Harbor, Japanese planners proceeded blindly, unaware that 3 American carriers were already at sea steaming toward Midway. The Doctrine's offensive focus had never prioritized reconnaissance or defensive intelligence, another fatal gap that Midway would expose. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force included 7 reconnaissance floatplanes, launched from cruisers and battleships to search sectors radiating from his fleet. On the morning of June 4th, one of these floatplanes, a Tone Cruiser's No. 4 aircraft, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems. This seemingly minor mechanical delay would have enormous consequences. The delayed floatplane was assigned to search the exact sector where American carriers were positioned. Had it launched on schedule, Japanese scouts might have detected the American task force before Nagumo committed his aircraft to striking Midway's land installations. Instead, Nagumo operated for crucial hours believing no American carriers threatened his force. This intelligence failure reflected systemic problems beyond individual mistakes. The Japanese naval establishment had created a command culture where uncomfortable truths were suppressed and optimistic assumptions validated without scrutiny. Officers learned that delivering bad news or expressing doubts about operational plans damaged careers, while enthusiastic endorsement of aggressive action earned promotion. Admiral Ugaki's diary entries, preserved at Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, reveal a command staff that interpreted absence of evidence for American carriers as evidence of absence, a logical fallacy that would prove catastrophic when American dive bombers appeared overhead without warning. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind and began launching 108 aircraft. 36 Kate torpedo bombers loaded with bombs for ground targets, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters as escort. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led this first wave toward Midway Atoll, visible as a gray smudge on the horizon 70 miles distant. Nagumo retained a second wave of aircraft aboard his carriers, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship operations should American naval forces appear. The Doctrine emphasized flexibility through maintaining reserves, but this approach would create a fatal vulnerability when circumstances forced rapid rearmament. Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese formation at 93 miles distance. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as every available American aircraft scrambled to intercept or evacuate. Marine fighter pilots flying obsolete Brewster Buffalo and Wildcat fighters climbed to intercept, their aircraft outmatched by the nimble Zeros escorting the attack force. The ensuing aerial combat was brutally one-sided. 15 of 26 Marine fighters were shot down within minutes, their pilots demonstrating courage that couldn't compensate for technological inferiority. Yet this sacrifice bought time for Midway's bomber force to launch and search for the Japanese carriers. Tomonaga's bombers struck Midway at 6:30, their bombs destroying fuel tanks, damaging the powerhouse, and setting wooden structures ablaze. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts, and several Japanese aircraft fell trailing smoke. Despite this damage, Midway remained operational, its runways still usable, its defenses still fighting. Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo at 7:07 with a message that would trigger the morning's crisis. There is need for a second attack wave. This assessment meant that Midway had not been neutralized and could still threaten a Japanese amphibious landing. Nagumo faced a decision that encapsulated the Doctrine's rigidity. His second-wave aircraft remained spotted on deck, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for engaging warships. Following Doctrine, he had maintained this anti-ship capability should American carriers appear. But Tomonaga's message indicated the immediate threat came from Midway's surviving installations. At 7:15, Nagumo ordered his second wave rearmed with land attack bombs, a process requiring 90 minutes as crews manhandled ordnance in the hangar decks. The decision reflected tactical logic, but ignored the possibility of simultaneous threats, precisely the kind of complex scenario that Doctrine had never adequately addressed. Even as Nagumo's carriers began the laborious rearmament process, Midway-based bombers were attacking his fleet. Army B-17 flying fortresses released bombs from high altitude that missed entirely. High-level bombing proved useless against maneuvering ships. Marine dive bombers pressed attacks with desperate courage, but were slaughtered by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Then came torpedo bombers, flying low and slow, their torpedoes easily evaded by the nimble Japanese carriers. Every American attack from Midway failed to score a single hit, yet these piecemeal assaults had important effects. They kept Japanese fighters busy at low altitude, consumed Japanese attention and ammunition, and reinforced Nagumo's belief that land-based aircraft represented the primary threat. At 7:28, while rearmament continued below decks, a message from the delayed tone cruiser floatplane shattered Nagumo's assumptions. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. American ships exactly where Doctrine insisted they shouldn't be. Nagumo demanded clarification. Were there carriers? The floatplane pilot, apparently uncertain, took 20 agonizing minutes to confirm. Enemy ships appear to be 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. This report was catastrophically wrong. The American force included 3 carriers, but Nagumo initially accepted it. Still, even 5 cruisers required anti-ship weapons. Should he reverse the rearmament order? The War Council's doctrine had never seriously prepared commanders for simultaneous threats from multiple directions. Nagumo found himself trapped between competing imperatives. Midway required a second strike, but American surface ships demanded anti-ship weapons. His indecision revealed the doctrine's fundamental weakness. It emphasized offensive aggression, but provided no framework for defensive adaptation when circumstances became complex. At 7:45, 25 minutes after receiving news of American ships, the delayed floatplanes finally reported enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Now Nagumo confronted the nightmare scenario. American carriers within striking range while his own aircraft were being rearmed below decks. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, urged immediate launch of whatever aircraft were available. Yamaguchi represented the aggressive, decisive action that Doctrine celebrated. But Nagumo hesitated, and this hesitation exposed another doctrinal flaw. The Imperial Navy's command structure discouraged subordinate initiative. Unlike American doctrine, which empowered commanders to act on local knowledge, Japanese naval culture emphasized rigid hierarchy and centralized control. Nagumo held overall command. Yamaguchi could only advise. And Nagumo, a battleship admiral thrust into carrier operations, lacked the instinctive feel for carrier warfare that circumstances now demanded. The situation grew more desperate as Tomonaga's first-wave aircraft began returning from Midway, low on fuel and some damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Doctrine and basic humanity demanded recovering these aircraft before launching a strike against American ships. Japanese carriers lacked the deck space to simultaneously land returning aircraft and launch new attacks, a limitation built into their design philosophy. Nagumo decided to recover the Midway strike force first, then launch a fully coordinated attack against the American carriers with properly armed aircraft. This decision reflected tactical logic and doctrinal emphasis on concentrated, overwhelming strikes rather than piecemeal attacks. But it granted the Americans precious time. Between 8 and 9 in the morning, Nagumo's 4 carriers became floating bombs. Their hangar decks filled with aviation fuel lines snaking across the floor as crews frantically rearmed aircraft. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs that had been removed sat unstowed. Doctrine called for ordnance to be properly secured in magazines, but the rush to rearm left weapons scattered dangerously throughout the hangars. Fuel trucks pumped gasoline into aircraft tanks. Mechanics swarmed over engines. On the flight decks above, crews prepared to land returning aircraft. Every minute the rearmament continued, vulnerability increased. Yet Nagumo saw no alternative. Doctrine demanded a properly coordinated strike, not desperate improvisation. American carrier aircraft were already approaching. Enterprise and Hornet had launched at 7:02, shortly after dawn, sending their entire striking power toward the projected position of the Japanese carriers. Yorktown launched later at 8:38 after confirming Japanese carrier locations. These American strikes totaled 155 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. However, the attack coordination immediately fell apart. Fighter escorts climbed to altitude while torpedo bombers stayed low. The formations separated and lost contact with each other. This fragmentation looked like tactical chaos, and by doctrinal standards it was chaos. But chaos can generate its own opportunities. The first American aircraft to find Nagumo's carriers were 15 torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. At 9:20, Waldron's TBD Devastators began their attack runs against Akagi and her screening ships. The Devastators flew at 100 knots just above the wave tops, giant targets for the Zeros that swarmed down on them. Japanese pilots shot down Waldron's aircraft one after another in a massacre that killed 29 of 30 men in the squadron. Not a single torpedo hit. The same slaughter claimed Enterprise's Torpedo 6 and Yorktown's Torpedo 3. 41 American torpedo bombers attacked Nagumo's carriers in 3 separate waves. 37 were shot down. 0 hits achieved. Doctrine had triumphed. Concentrated defensive firepower had annihilated uncoordinated piecemeal attacks. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bomber squadron from Enterprise emerged from scattered clouds at 14,000 feet, directly above the Japanese carriers. McCluskey had been searching for 90 minutes, his fuel running critically low when he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast and correctly guessed it was heading toward the main carrier force. Following that lone destroyer, McCluskey found all 4 of Nagumo's carriers steaming in a tight box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The Japanese had beaten off every American attack for 3 hours. Their fighter cover patrolled low altitude after destroying the torpedo bombers. And now American dive bombers plunged down from the sun with nothing to stop them. Japanese lookouts spotted the American dive bombers at the last possible moment. Frantic warnings crackled across radio circuits, but the Zeros remained at low altitude, unable to climb quickly enough to intercept. Anti-aircraft guns swung skyward, but dive bombers descending at 250 miles per hour gave gunners only seconds to acquire targets. At 10:26, bombs began falling. The War Council's rigid doctrine had created this vulnerability. By keeping all 4 carriers close together for mutual protection and concentrated striking power, Nagumo had ensured that a single American attack could engage multiple targets simultaneously. Dispersion might have reduced coordination efficiency but would have prevented catastrophic, concentrated damage. Doctrine had never seriously considered such trade-offs. Lieutenant Richard Best's 3-plane section dove on Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck just behind the carrier's midship elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where it exploded among aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar as aviation fuel ignited and ordnance cooked off. Within minutes, uncontrollable fires were racing through Akagi's interior spaces. Nagumo and his staff abandoned the flagship, transferring to the light cruiser Nagara in a humiliating evacuation that left Akagi burning without command. The carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack now drifted as a flaming wreck, her crew fighting fires they could never contain. Simultaneously, other dive bombers hit Kaga and Soryu. Kaga absorbed 4 bomb hits in rapid succession that transformed her hangar deck into an inferno. 1 bomb detonated in the middle of aircraft spotted for launch. Another penetrated to the machinery spaces and ruptured fuel lines. A third ignited munitions, and a 4th killed everyone on the bridge, including the captain. Fires merged into a single firestorm that consumed the carrier's interior. Historical accounts compiled by Japanese naval historian Mitsuo Fuchida, who survived the battle, describe crews trapped below decks as temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees and structural steel warped from the heat. Kaga's aviation fuel tanks exploded at 2:03 that afternoon, breaking the carrier's back and sending her to the bottom. Soryu suffered 3 bomb hits that set her ablaze within minutes. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to abandon ship even as flames swept across the bridge. Survivors reported seeing Yanagimoto singing the national anthem as fire surrounded him, choosing death over the disgrace of surviving his carrier's loss. This adherence to Bushido principles, death before dishonor, represented the cultural bedrock supporting the War Council's aggressive doctrine. But courage and honor could not extinguish the fires consuming Soryu. The carrier capsized and sank at 7:13 that evening, taking Yanagimoto and 718 crew members to the bottom. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were destroyed in 5 minutes. American dive bombers had achieved what the War Council insisted was impossible: a decisive reversal through uncoordinated, opportunistic attack. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was operating separately several miles away and escaped the initial strike. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately launched counterstrikes against the American carriers, demonstrating the offensive reflexes that Doctrine celebrated. His aircraft found and crippled Yorktown with bomb and torpedo hits that left her dead in the water. But this tactical success could not reverse the strategic catastrophe. 3 Japanese carriers were gone. The doctrine of decisive battle had delivered a decisive defeat. Aboard the super battleship Yamato, steaming 70 miles northwest of the burning carriers, Admiral Yamamoto received catastrophic news in fragmentary radio transmissions: Akagi hit, Kaga burning, Soryu sinking. The messages arrived in confusing sequence, their import initially unclear through the chaos of electronic warfare and smoke-choked radio channels. When the full scale of the disaster finally penetrated command understanding, Yamamoto's staff faced a crisis for which Doctrine provided no guidance. The plan had called for overwhelming carrier superiority to crush American resistance. Instead, 3/4 of the strike force was gone, and American carriers remained operational. The War Council's entire strategic framework, predicated on Japanese offensive dominance, had collapsed. Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, advocated continuing the operation using Hiryu's aircraft and Yamato's massive guns to bombard Midway. This response reflected doctrinal conditioning: attack, always attack, never retreat or acknowledge defeat. But Yamamoto recognized that without carrier air cover, his battleships would be vulnerable to American airstrikes. The doctrine had always emphasized carriers as battleship support, ensuring air superiority for the main gun battle. Now the carriers were gone. Yamamoto found himself commanding the most powerful surface fleet in the world, rendered impotent by the loss of 4 flight decks. The realization exposed how thoroughly carrier aviation had revolutionized naval warfare in ways the decisive battle doctrine had never fully internalized. Meanwhile, Hiryu's aircraft had succeeded in crippling Yorktown, but American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu at 5:03 that afternoon. 4 bombs hit the Japanese carrier in rapid succession, starting fires identical to those consuming her sister ships. Admiral Yamaguchi, the aggressive proponent of immediate counterattack that morning, now faced his own carrier's destruction. He chose to die with his ship, remaining aboard, as Hiryu burned through the night. Before his death, Yamaguchi sent a final message apologizing for failing to achieve victory, a sentiment encapsulating the War Council's inability to accept that doctrine itself had failed, not individual commanders. Yamamoto ordered general withdrawal at 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, abandoning the Midway operation and retreating toward Japan. This decision represented institutional admission of defeat, unprecedented in modern Japanese naval history. The withdrawal order triggered bitter recriminations within the command structure. Some staff officers argued for continuing the battle, insisting that Japanese night fighting superiority and battleship firepower could still overwhelm the Americans if pursued aggressively. But Yamamoto recognized that the War Council's fundamental strategic assumption, Japanese offensive dominance leading to quick victory, had been shattered. Without carriers, he could not protect his battleships from air attack. The Doctrine had promised decisive battle on Japanese terms. Midway had delivered decisive battle on American terms. The institutional response to Midway revealed how deeply rigid thinking had permeated Japanese naval culture. Rather than conducting honest assessment of doctrinal failures, the Naval General Staff immediately suppressed information about the defeat. Survivors were quarantined when they returned to Japan, forbidden from discussing the battle even with family members. Officers were ordered to maintain silence about the 4 carriers' loss. Official casualty lists were falsified. The War Council feared that acknowledging such catastrophic defeat would undermine morale and political support for continued war. This instinct for concealment over candor ensured that the same doctrinal flaws that caused Midway would persist in subsequent operations. Admiral Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, briefed Emperor Hirohito on June 8, 4 days after the battle. According to Privy Council records, Nagano minimized the defeat's significance, claiming it represented merely a temporary setback that Japanese industrial capacity would overcome. The Naval General Staff never conducted the kind of rigorous after-action analysis that might have identified fundamental doctrinal problems. Instead, they attributed defeat to bad luck, poor intelligence, and individual errors, explanations that preserved institutional face while preventing meaningful reform. The War Council had created a system incapable of learning from its failures because the culture of infallibility made honest self-assessment institutionally impossible. The Battle of Midway destroyed not only 4 irreplaceable carriers and their veteran aircrews, but also the strategic coherence that had guided Japanese naval planning since Tsushima. The War Council had premised expansion on a rapid series of victories that would create a defensive perimeter from the Aleutians through Midway to Port Moresby, New Guinea. With this perimeter secured by carrier air power and defended by island garrisons, Japan would possess the economic resources of Southeast Asia, while Americans exhausted themselves in futile attempts to breach the defense line. Eventually, according to this logic, Washington would negotiate peace accepting Japanese dominance in the Western Pacific. Midway shattered this strategy by eliminating the carrier strength necessary to maintain offensive initiative. Japanese naval leadership faced a choice after Midway: acknowledge doctrinal failure and develop new approaches suited to protracted defensive warfare, or persist with decisive battle concepts despite inadequate resources. The War Council chose persistence. Admiral Nagano and his staff convinced themselves that building new carriers and training replacement aircrews would restore offensive capability within a year. This analysis catastrophically underestimated American industrial mobilization. By late 1942, American shipyards were launching fleet carriers every few months, while Japanese yards struggled to complete even one. The carrier gap would widen, not narrow. But the Doctrine's offensive focus prevented Japanese planners from recognizing that defensive attrition warfare offered better prospects than seeking another Midway-style decisive engagement. The Imperial Japanese Navy did attempt tactical adaptations. They improved damage control procedures after studying why their carriers burned so easily. They developed night fighting tactics hoping to exploit this perceived advantage over American forces. They designed larger carriers with better armor protection, but these modifications addressed symptoms rather than the underlying strategic problem. Japan lacked the industrial base to wage sustained attritional war against American production capacity. The Doctrine had never seriously grappled with this reality because it assumed quick victory would precede any test of relative industrial strength. Midway exposed this assumption as fantasy. Personnel losses compounded material deficiencies in ways the War Council never fully appreciated. The 4 carriers lost at Midway took down over 200 highly trained pilots and aircrew, veterans with years of experience flying from carrier decks in all conditions. Japanese naval aviation training emphasized quality over quantity, producing excellent but limited numbers of pilots. American training programs prioritized volume, accepting slightly lower individual skill levels to field larger numbers of adequately trained aviators. After Midway, Japanese pilot quality steadily declined as training programs compressed to replace losses, while American pilot numbers and skill levels simultaneously increased. By 1944, the disparity was overwhelming. The War Council's response to these realities involved increasingly desperate gambits that reflected doctrinal rigidity more than strategic clarity. The naval staff continued planning for decisive surface battles centered on battleships, even as carrier aviation had rendered battleships secondary. Resources flowed toward constructing the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, with their 18-inch guns capable of outranging any opponent, while carrier production lagged despite evidence that carriers were decisive. This misallocation reflected institutional bias toward the gun battle that Doctrine promised would ultimately determine Pacific supremacy, ignoring Midway's lesson that carriers had fundamentally transformed naval warfare. By mid-1943, American forces had seized the initiative throughout the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Campaign Island hopped toward Japan, bypassing heavily fortified positions to seize strategic locations where American engineers constructed airfields within weeks. Each captured island brought American bombers closer to Japan's home islands, while stretching Japanese defensive lines ever thinner. Simultaneously, General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Campaign advanced through New Guinea toward the Philippines. Japanese forces fought desperately, but could not prevent the steady American advance sustained by industrial production that dwarfed anything Japan could match. The Doctrine's promise that Bushido spirit would overcome material disadvantage proved tragically hollow as American steel and explosives ground down Japanese resistance through sheer accumulated weight. On the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across Japanese radio in the first imperial broadcast most citizens had ever heard, announcing acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and Japan's surrender. The War Council that had confidently launched aggression in 1941 had led the empire to catastrophic defeat that killed over 3 million Japanese, devastated the home islands through firebombing and atomic weapons, and destroyed Japan's status as a great power. The path from Midway to this moment illustrated how doctrinal rigidity, institutional arrogance, and cultural unwillingness to acknowledge failure had transformed initial tactical setback into strategic annihilation. The failure to pivot after Midway had consequences extending far beyond that single battle. Had Japanese leadership honestly assessed the defeat's implications, particularly the impossibility of matching American industrial production in a protracted war, they might have sought negotiated settlement in late 1942, when Japan still held significant territorial gains. Instead, the War Council doubled down on aggressive expansion, initiating further offensives in the Solomon Islands that led to grinding attrition battles around Guadalcanal. These campaigns consumed aircraft, ships, and experienced personnel that Japan could not replace, while Americans fielded ever-increasing numbers of newer, better equipment, operated by adequately trained crews. The Doctrine's emphasis on offensive, decisive battle made meaningful strategic reassessment psychologically and institutionally impossible. Admitting that Midway represented fundamental validation failure rather than mere tactical setback would have required acknowledging that decades of planning and training had been misdirected. The officers who had built their careers on decisive battle theory could not accept such devastating institutional critique without essentially repudiating their professional identities. Cultural factors reinforced this resistance. Japanese military culture emphasized loyalty, hierarchy, and face-saving over candid assessment and adaptation. Junior officers who recognized doctrinal problems lacked institutional power to force change, while senior leadership remained psychologically invested in approaches that had defined their worldview. The human cost of this failure staggered comprehension. Japanese casualties in the Pacific War exceeded 2 million military dead, plus at least 800,000 civilian deaths from combat, firebombing, atomic weapons, and starvation. The firebombing of Tokyo on the 9th and 10th of March 1945 killed roughly 100,000 people in a single night, more than died immediately from either atomic bomb. These casualties resulted from strategic decisions rooted in the doctrine that Midway should have discredited, but which Japanese leadership clung to despite mounting evidence of failure. The War Council's inability to pivot after Midway thus transformed one battle's defeat into a nation's catastrophe. For the United States, Midway validated a flexible approach to doctrine that emphasized initiative, adaptation, and industrial mobilization over rigid planning and spiritual factors. American commanders made numerous tactical mistakes during the battle: poor coordination, inadequate fighter protection for torpedo bombers, and initial intelligence gaps. But the command culture permitted learning from these errors and implementing improvements rapidly. American carrier tactics evolved constantly throughout the war, incorporating lessons from each engagement to develop better procedures. Japanese tactics remained largely static, frozen by doctrinal rigidity and institutional resistance to acknowledging that established approaches had failed. The Battle of Midway has been extensively documented by military historians including Gordon Prange, whose detailed account, Miracle at Midway, draws on both American and Japanese sources to reconstruct the battle's progression. Prange's work, alongside Mitsuo Fuchida's first-hand Japanese perspective, reveals how completely the War Council's doctrinal failures shaped the battle's outcome and subsequent strategic trajectory. These historical analyses demonstrate that Midway was not simply a lucky American victory, but rather the inevitable result of systemic Japanese institutional dysfunction meeting flexible American adaptation. In the decades since 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy's failure at Midway has become a canonical case study in how rigid doctrine, institutional arrogance, and cultural unwillingness to acknowledge mistakes can transform tactical setbacks into strategic catastrophe. The War Council's inability to pivot, to recognize that their fundamental assumptions about naval warfare, industrial capacity, and American resolve were catastrophically wrong, ensured that Midway's 5 minutes of devastation would echo across 4 more years of increasingly desperate conflict that Japan could not win, but would not abandon, until atomic weapons and Soviet invasion finally penetrated the institutional denial that had replaced rational strategic assessment. The 4 carriers burning in the Central Pacific on June 4, 1942, were consuming more than ships and men. They were consuming the entire strategic framework that had guided Japan into a war that doctrine promised was winnable, but reality proved was not.